It was a late night along the Queensland coast in 1983. The shift had already stretched past 11, and the rural back roads north of Brisbane were quiet. Out here, cane fields pressed close to narrow bitumen roads, their stalks tall and dense enough to swallow sound. At night, the only signs of life were the low hum of insects and the occasional passing truck on the highway miles away. 2 officers were assigned to patrol this district that night. One was a senior constable, with nearly a decade of experience behind him. His time on the job had taught him to balance methodical caution with quick decisions. The habits of someone who had seen many late-night calls resolve into nothing but still treated each one with seriousness. Following behind in another unit was a younger constable, only a few years into the service. He was alert, eager to observe, and still learning how to read the strange quiet of these back roads after dark. Inside the district communications office, the operator kept the night shift routine. Radio chatter was light. Calls had slowed, and most units were already heading back towards station areas. But at 11:34 p.m., something unusual broke through. On the open channel, a faint voice cut in, distorted by static. The operator leaned forward, adjusting the volume, trying to isolate words that slipped in and out of the hiss. What he caught was fragmented. A woman's voice, soft and uneven, with short phrases carried only halfway across the airwaves. The operator thought he heard, "Help," followed by something that sounded like, "Can't see." Then silence. There was no unit identifier, no preamble, nothing that suggested this was a normal transmission. Standard calls from the field always began with a call sign or reference to dispatch. This had been different, something faint, out of place, yet clear enough to note. The operator logged it immediately as a possible distress call. Within 4 minutes, 2 units were assigned to respond. The call-out was vague, only that a female voice had broken into the channel and referenced a rural road within the patrol district. The 2 officers were already nearby, within a 15-kilometer radius of the point of interest. They acknowledged dispatch and began moving toward the location. The drive took them deeper into farmland, where cane fields lined both sides of the road. The night air was warm and heavy, with the kind of humidity that seemed to press against the cruiser's glass. Pockets of low fog pooled in the hollows near culverts, where water drainage cut under the road. Visibility was fair overall, but at ground level, the fog drifted in uneven sheets, swallowing the verge in places and making the beams of headlights scatter into pale cones. The only noise was the steady hum of the patrol engines, the occasional crunch of gravel when a tire strayed to the road edge, and the faint hiss of the radios, always left open on the channel. At 11:48 p.m., both patrols caught fragments again. The young constable heard a sudden burst of static, then what sounded like a sharp intake of breath. The senior constable's unit caught the same. A single word emerged, half-formed, and then the line dissolved back into static. It was enough to sharpen their attention. Both officers recognized that hearing the same fragment across separate units meant the signal was not a malfunction of one radio. The voice was being carried across the channel to all receivers in range. By 11:56 p.m., they reached the designated area, a T-junction flanked by cane fields, with a culvert running beneath the road. A sodium street lamp stood at the corner, its orange glow struggling against the fog. The light was unstable, cycling dim and bright in irregular intervals, a common fault in older fittings. Each time it dimmed, the road looked abandoned, the cane swaying gently in the stillness before brightening again into an overexposed haze. both officers parked near the junction and stepped out. Gravel crunched under their boots. The air carried a faint damp smell from the culvert, mixed with the dry rustle of cane leaves in the breeze. The radios, clipped to their belts and running in the cars, still carried a faint hiss, even when nothing else came through. Their first actions were by the book. Torches swept along the road surface, checking for skid marks, debris, or any sign of a vehicle leaving the bitumen. The culvert was checked for wreckage or fluid, but nothing unusual was found. The smell of fuel or oil, often the first clue of a hidden crash, was absent. The scene held no indication that an accident had occurred here. At 12:03 a.m., as both officers regrouped near their vehicles, a fragment came through again. This time it was clearer, though still incomplete. A female voice, faint but distinct enough to carry tone. It was strained, hurried, and broke off mid-phrase. Both officers froze, listening closely as static resumed. The senior constable tested equipment. First, he switched between the portable set on his belt and the in-car radio. Both carried the same fragment when it came through. It confirmed that the signal was not limited to one faulty receiver. At 12:11 a.m., the younger constable diverted to check a farm track about 600 meters from the junction. The track cut between cane rows and led toward a distant shed, barely visible in the fog. He drove in slowly, headlights cutting through pale mist and picking up the silvery edges of cane stalks. The track showed no tire marks fresher than a few days, and the shed itself was locked and dark. He circled back and rejoined the junction patrol. Meanwhile, dispatch had run checks with neighboring districts. No other services were confirmed to be transmitting on their frequency. The operator reported back calmly, noting that whatever they were receiving was not coming from regular traffic. At 12:19 a.m., both patrols caught another fragment. The voice returned, faint and clipped, but with audio quality that shifted slightly, as though it were moving or carried differently through the air. Officers logged the time. By now, the search had drawn the attention of at least one local. Around 12:27 a.m., a farmhand approached the junction on foot. He was middle-aged, wearing work clothes and looking tired but cooperative. He told the officers he had heard a woman's voice earlier that night, but he was clear on one point. It hadn't sounded like someone shouting across the fields. Instead, it had sounded like a voice coming from a radio. The officers noted his comment, adding it to their growing sense that what they were dealing with was not a typical distress call from the roadside. The scene remained quiet, except for the hiss of their radios and the occasional rustle of cane. The sodium lamp continued its cycle of dimming and flaring, throwing the junction into shifting light. By 12:41 a.m., the strongest reception came through. Both patrol cars, almost simultaneously, picked up fragments of what seemed to be distressed breathing, followed by broken words. It lasted only a few seconds, then cut back to silence. But in that brief window, it was clearer than anything before. Both officers exchanged a glance, each recognizing the other had heard the same. They had reached the midpoint of the night. The road was empty, the fog persistent, and the signal elusive but undeniable. The call had begun as a faint intrusion into the airwaves. Now it had drawn 2 officers and a local witness into a search that was unfolding step by step, with nothing solid to show for it. The officers stood at the junction, their patrol cars idling on opposite verges. The sodium lamp overhead hummed faintly, then flickered again, dropping the road into near darkness before surging back to life. Each time it dimmed, the cane fields seemed to close in. the rows of stalks forming tall walls that gave no sign of movement. What held their attention was not the scene itself, but the unpredictable burst from their radios. The clearest signal had just broken through, a voice straining against distortion, breathing heavy, then lost again to static. For a moment, both officers had listened without moving, each hearing the same fragments carried across different units. The senior constable noted the detail in his log. This was no isolated equipment fault. The younger constable, unsettled but focused, walked a slow arc around the culvert, sweeping his torch over the waterline. He saw nothing unusual, only still water reflecting the orange lamp overhead and the faint outlines of reeds along the bank. The senior constable decided to broaden the sweep. One vehicle remained at the junction, while the other drove in slow loops along the feeder roads branching out. The radios stayed open, each officer listening intently for the next break in the static. As the younger constable moved down one narrow road, the voice returned. This time it lasted only a second, just a faint gasp, and a syllable that might have been the start of a word. He braked, headlights cutting into the fog, but the verge showed nothing, and the fields beside him stretched without interruption. He keyed his mic, checking if the senior had caught it too. The answer came back. Yes, the same fragment, received at the same time. Both officers recognized a pattern forming. The signal wasn't confined to one spot. It seemed to move, flaring and fading in ways that didn't match the search grid. When they drove onto slight rises, the fragments sounded clearer. In the dips, the static deepened, almost swallowing the transmission entirely. At 12:19 a.m., the district communications operator confirmed again that no neighboring units were transmitting. The frequency was theirs alone. That ruled out normal traffic. Yet the voice kept returning, always partial, always just beyond reach. The young constable's patrol eased back toward the junction. On the roadside, the farmhand still lingered, curious but uneasy. He explained more of what he'd heard earlier in the night. According to him, the sound had carried across the fields, but not like a person calling out. Instead, it had sounded tinny, distorted, as if lifted from a speaker. His impression was that it had come from somewhere close to where he stood now, yet he hadn't seen anyone. The senior constable thanked him and made a note. Witness input mattered, even when it only deepened the uncertainty. The officers regrouped and decided to hold position for several minutes, monitoring the channel. The radios hissed steadily, but offered nothing else until, at 12:41 a.m., the strongest signal yet cut through. Both cars, near simultaneously, picked up the sound of distressed breathing. The breaths were uneven, ragged, with a single word carried faintly between them. For several seconds the audio held, long enough for both men to feel the weight of hearing something undeniably human in tone. Then the line collapsed again into static. Neither officer spoke right away. Both knew that if a real emergency were taking place, this might be the closest they would come to pinpointing it. Yet the road and fields remained empty. No headlights, no debris, no sound beyond their own equipment. The senior constable ordered a wider search. Between 12:58 and 1:20 a.m., both units expanded their sweep to cover a 3-kilometer radius. They took feeder roads branching toward the highway, drove past isolated farmhouses, and paused near drainage lines where fog still pulled thick. Every stop was accompanied by torch sweeps, checking verges and culverts. Each time the radios were tested, they returned only static. The stronger fragments were gone. What had been a clear signal minutes earlier now faded to a faint hiss. At one point, The younger constable stood outside his cruiser with the portable radio raised, rotating slowly as though trying to catch a clearer angle. In certain directions, the static shifted slightly, softer in tone, but it never carried words again. By 1:20 a.m., the search grid had been covered without result. The roads were clear, the fields undisturbed, the culverts empty. The sodium lamp at the junction still flickered in its cycle, but the fog had begun to thin, drifting into patches rather than sheets. As visibility improved, the sense of immediacy lessened. The senior constable logged the lack of findings. His notes included the repeated timing of transmissions, the simultaneous reception across units, and the absence of any physical evidence. He weighed whether to extend the search further, but the lack of direction made it impractical. There was no triangulation possible, no way to lock down where the voice had originated. By 1:36 a.m., the decision was made to stand down. Both units returned to routine patrol, radio still open but no longer receiving fragments. The last sound had been nearly 15 minutes earlier, already weakening before disappearing entirely. For the rest of the shift, nothing more came through. The hiss that had filled their radios slowly gave way to the usual silence of an empty channel. By the time the officers logged off in the early hours of the morning, the incident had already begun to take shape as one more unexplained entry in their reports. The official record would describe it simply: unidentified intermittent transmission, no incident located. No crash, no missing person, no emergency call to explain the night's events. Just fragments, logged with times, and the recollections of 2 officers and a farmhand who had all heard the same thing without being able to find a source. The following morning, the incident was already reduced to a brief handover note. The senior constable's log was clear and professional, but it left little room for interpretation. The entry read as a series of times, events, and outcomes, with the last line recording the decision to stand down. There had been no evidence of a crash, no persons located, and no further transmissions after 1:36 a.m. The district communications operator had filed his own notes as well. He had logged the initial intrusion at 11:34 p.m., describing the voice as female, faint, and without a call sign. His notes confirmed that the words "help" and "can't see" had been audible but indistinct. He also logged his checks with neighboring districts, showing no other services were transmitting on their channel at the time. Together, the records presented a factual account of what had happened. 2 patrol units, an unexplained voice on the police frequency, a prolonged search of the area, and no physical incident discovered. The next step was routine maintenance. A request was made for the channel to be tested, in case faulty equipment or interference had been responsible. The technicians found no fault with the local system. Radios performed normally, and the frequency was clear. Nothing in the hardware explained why voices had cut across the channel the night before. What was equally telling was what did not appear in subsequent reports. No missing persons were filed that matched the time frame. No crashes were reported along the feeder roads or highway. No emergency was later discovered that could have accounted for a woman attempting to call for help near the cane fields. In the absence of those connections, the incident remained in its narrow form. Unexplained radio transmissions with no physical outcome. Among the officers, the experience was discussed quietly. For the younger constable, it had been an unusual test of judgment. He had carried out every check, followed every lead, and still come back with nothing. For the senior, it had been another reminder that some calls simply ended without resolution. Both agreed on one thing: They had heard the same fragments at the same times across separate units. Whatever had been on the channel that night, it had not been imagined. In the broader context of the time, this incident was not entirely unique. In the 1980s, analog UHF radios were the backbone of police communication in regional Queensland. They were effective but vulnerable. Atmospheric conditions along the coast sometimes carried distant signals far beyond their usual reach. On humid nights, particularly when fog and still air held close to the ground, voices from other frequencies could drift in. Operators referred to it as propagation, an effect of radio waves bending or reflecting in ways that made transmissions seem local when they were not. That explanation accounted for many such incidents, but not all of them. Some officers recalled nights when voices came through with striking clarity, carrying a fragments that suggested distress, but never led to a traceable incident. They were logged sparingly, often dismissed as interference unless tied to a confirmed call. The ghost calls, as they were sometimes referred to informally, became part of the background experience of night patrols in coastal districts. The Queensland coast was not alone in this. Similar accounts had surfaced in other parts of Australia and overseas as well, wherever analog systems were in use. The phenomenon tended to follow the same pattern: faint voices, short phrases, no identifiers, and no corresponding event discovered on the ground. For the men who had been at the junction that night, the memory stayed sharper than the log suggested. The farmhand's words lingered, that what he had heard sounded as though it came from a radio, not from someone calling across the fields, and the simultaneous reception in both cars, at its strongest around 12:41 a.m., gave the sense of something immediate, something that felt close even if it had not been. The incident was never reopened, and no later development tied it to a real case. In that way, it remained self-contained, preserved only in station logs and in the recollections of those involved. Looking back, it fit a category of events that police work occasionally produces: calls that are followed thoroughly, recorded carefully, but never explained. They sit at the edge of procedure, where professionalism demands closure, but the facts allow none. In the weeks after, the younger constable asked about similar events. He was told by colleagues that radio interference was part of night shifts, particularly along the coast. Most of the time, it meant nothing, but he noticed that when the subject came up, more experienced officers often spoke with a tone that suggested they remembered their own odd nights, times when a call had come through that led nowhere, yet stayed with them anyway. In the years that followed, analog systems were gradually replaced with digital ones, less prone to the same forms of interference. The reports of unexplained voices became rarer, but for those who had been on duty in the early 1980s, the memories of voices cutting through static remained a part of their working lives. The ghostly radio calls of 1983 in Queensland closed without escalation. No missing person, no accident, no further action required. But for the officers at the junction, the farmhand who listened across the fields, and the operator who first caught the words out, help, and psst, I can't see, the night carried a weight beyond its report. It was one more reminder of the limits of certainty in police work. A call comes in, officers respond, evidence is sought. Sometimes it leads to resolution, sometimes it does not. And sometimes, as on that humid night among the cane fields, it leaves only a record of static and voices that faded as quickly as they arrived. The file was logged, archived and moved aside for the next shift's concerns. But for those who experienced it, the memory of that faint voice breaking across the channel, fragmented, urgent, and unexplained, remained, carried quietly in the margins of their service. It was late evening in Savannah, Georgia, in the year 1963. The day had been warm, heavy with the kind of southern humidity that lingered long after sunset. A line of rain showers had passed earlier, leaving the air damp inside the thick stone walls of the Chatham County Jail. By 10 o'clock that night, the routines of the block had quieted. The sound of boots on concrete echoed down the corridors, steady and predictable. Metal keys rattled occasionally, carrying sharp against the stillness. Inside, the jail was kept to a pattern. Tier rounds were made by deputies, doors checked, inmates accounted for. Most nights, this pattern continued without interruption, the silence broken only by low voices or the metallic clang of a cell door sliding shut. On this particular night, the shift was supervised by a sergeant with more than 15 years of service. He had worked the jail long enough to recognize when something was out of place and had the calm, steady demeanor of a man who had dealt with every kind of inmate disturbance. Alongside him were two deputies. They were younger, carrying out the standard rounds of the block, their duties straightforward: check each tier, confirm all cells secured, respond if inmates grew unruly. Neither expected the shift to be any different from the dozens before it. At 10 minutes past 10, the radio operator in the building logged nothing unusual. Unlike a patrol unit out on the road, the jail had no dispatch calls to direct its work. Events began inside its own walls, and on this night, they began with a sudden voice cutting through the quiet. At 10:02 p.m., an inmate in a single cell began shouting. His voice carried sharp and urgent, bouncing off the block's concrete walls. Deputies moving nearby heard the commotion and quickened their pace toward the source. The shouts were not the usual kind of complaint. The man was yelling that someone else was in his cell. The inmate was housed alone, his door secured. The deputies reached the bars within moments. They found him pressed tightly against them, his hands clamped around the steel. Sweat ran down his face despite the damp air. He pointed toward the back corner of the narrow cell, insisting that someone was standing there. The deputies shone their flashlights through the bars. The beams caught the cracked paint of the walls, the worn bedding on the bunk, and the bare concrete floor. There was no one else inside, but the inmate would not be convinced. He repeated his words in a strained voice, saying a man was standing silently in the corner. His description grew more specific. The figure wore an old uniform and simply stared at him without moving. The deputies exchanged a glance, recognizing that his panic was not feigned. They told him to step back from the bars, but he clung to them, his eyes fixed on the space behind them. What they saw was only the wall, darkened where the flashlight beam did not reach. By 10:05 p.m., the noise had drawn the attention of others on the tier. The deputies worked quickly to calm the situation, but the inmate kept pointing, insisting the man was still there. He was shaking, his breathing uneven, his voice breaking between shouts and gasps. 3 minutes later, at 10:08, one of the deputies radioed for the sergeant. Experience dictated that unusual disturbances be addressed with supervisory presence. The sergeant arrived within minutes, his boots striking against the tier floor. He stood at the bars, observing the inmate and the deputies' flashlight sweeps. The door was checked again, still locked, the key accounted for on the ring he carried. No signs of tampering or forced entry. The sergeant gave clear instructions. The inmate was to be removed from the cell and the space searched. The deputies unlocked the heavy door at 10:16 p.m., the metallic clang echoing down the block. Cautiously, they stepped inside, their torches lighting every corner. The inmate was guided out into the corridor, where he continued to shout back at them. He insisted the figure remained, now behind them, in the cell, as they moved through it. The deputies ignored the words long enough to complete their check. They examined the bunk, the floor, the walls, even the ceiling for any loose fixture or hidden contraband. Nothing. The narrow space contained only what it always had: a concrete bed, iron bars, and peeling paint. From the corridor, the inmate's shouting did not relent. He strained against the deputies holding him, his face pale and wet with sweat. He called out that the man was still there, unmoving, behind the officers who searched the room. At 10:19 p.m., the sergeant noted something unusual himself. The air in the cell felt colder than expected. The night outside was humid, the building itself thick and damp with retained heat. Yet within that confined space, a chill hung in the air, noticeable enough that both deputies remarked on it later. The search produced no explanation. No hidden person, no tampered lock, no contraband. The inmate was temporarily relocated to the holding area while the cell was cleared. At 10:24 p.m., the sergeant gave the order, and the deputies guided the man down the corridor. His body resisted, refusing to angle back toward the cell, his eyes locked on the corner where he claimed the figure remained. As the heavy door shut behind them, the sound carried sharply down the block. For a moment, the tier returned to its familiar stillness. Yet as the officers stood inside the now empty cell, they remarked quietly on the same chill. One deputy noted the sensation of a faint draft against his arm. Another mentioned the echo of footsteps that seemed to carry within the block, though all three men were accounted for in that one space. The sergeant resecured the cell at 10:32 p.m., marking it locked once again. His notes would later mention a lingering draft that seemed to persist despite closed windows and heavy stone walls. But for the moment, he carried on with procedure, knowing the inmate was safe in holding, and the block had returned to order. The sergeant's decision to move the inmate to holding was meant as a temporary measure, the kind of step that restored order quickly while leaving space for further checks. But as the minutes passed, the incident refused to settle fully into routine. The inmate, now seated in the holding tank, refused to calm. Even with deputies nearby, he shouted through the bars, insisting the figure remained in his cell. The claim was specific. The man wore an older-style uniform, unfamiliar to him, but described as heavy and dark, without insignia he could name. He said the figure would not speak, only stare, motionless. The deputies glanced toward the sergeant, expecting dismissal, but he did not wave it off entirely. His years on the job had taught him that even when inmates exaggerated or imagined things, their physical reactions told a story of their own. This one was drenched in sweat, shaking visibly, and his hands clutched the bars as if they were the only solid ground left to him. Panic like that was hard to fake, and harder still to maintain once a person realized no one else could see what they were seeing. At 10:32 p.m., the sergeant and his deputies returned to the tier. The cell door was secured again, heavy and unmoving. They paused at the threshold listening. The rest of the block had fallen silent after the earlier shouting. Only the sound of dripping water somewhere down the corridor and the faint hum of overhead fixtures carried through. When they stepped inside again, the sergeant noted the same chill he had felt minutes before. It did not make sense in a building like this, where the stone walls usually trapped the day's heat and held it well past midnight. He pressed his hand against the wall and found it cool, cooler than the corridor outside. One deputy mentioned it quietly, the odd sensation of a draft, as if air was moving despite sealed windows. Another remarked on the faint echo of footsteps, though all three were standing still. They exchanged glances, but none spoke further on it. Procedure mattered, and procedure meant completing the search with professionalism. The flashlights cut across the peeling paint, catching the damp shine on concrete. They tracked every surface again, sweeping the bunk frame, the corners, and the cracks where wall met floor. Nothing suggested tampering. No contraband, no hidden person, no place where anyone could have been concealed. The sergeant instructed the deputies to step back. He locked the cell again himself, sliding the heavy key into the mechanism and turning until the bolt snapped closed. The sound echoed through the block. He tested it once more, pulling firmly against the handle. It held. In the holding tank, the inmate continued to insist the man had not left. He yelled through the corridor that the figure was still standing there, that he had seen it remain in the corner even as deputies searched. To him, the silent presence was clear and undeniable. The deputies returned to check on him at 10:45 p.m. He had calmed slightly, but remained pale, his breathing uneven. When asked again what he had seen, he repeated the same description. A man in an old uniform, watching, refusing to move or speak. He wouldn't leave, the inmate said. He just stood there. The detail did not change, even as his agitation eased. The sergeant made a note. In his experience, when inmates fabricated or embellished, their story shifted as questions pressed them. This one did not. The account was consistent, given the same way each time, though no one else could confirm it. Back on the tier, the deputies resumed rounds. The clang of keys and doors marked their passage, steady and familiar, but the mood had shifted. Each sound seemed sharper, carrying further in the silence that followed. One deputy thought he heard footsteps again, measured, deliberate, as though trailing them by a pace or two. He turned quickly, beam sweeping the corridor, but the space was empty. The noise had no source. The sergeant, though skeptical, could not shake the cold air of the cell. He had felt it twice now, unmistakable against the muggy air of the building. For a moment, he considered whether the inmate's story was less about hallucination and more about perception. Something seen by one man but not the others. Something that didn't leave a trace. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on procedure. By 11 o'clock, the jail had returned to its pattern. Inmates were quiet. Rounds were resumed. The incident was noted as a disturbance. The inmate held in a different cell for the remainder of the shift. But for the deputies, the minutes inside that locked cell lingered. Both spoke later of the unnatural draft, the way it seemed to move against their skin though the walls were sealed. They remembered the footsteps, faint but distinct, travelling down the tier when no one was walking. And they remembered the inmates' wide eyes, fixed on a corner of bare concrete where they had seen nothing at all. The sergeant wrote his report carefully. He listed times, actions, and outcomes. He noted that the cell had been searched thoroughly, with no findings. He included the inmate's description as a claim, but did not elaborate further. Officially, the matter was closed as a disturbance, likely the product of stress or imagination. But in the quiet exchanges between staff later that week, the story took on another weight. Some recalled that the jail stood on old ground, part of Savannah's long history of encampments and war. Others noted that decades earlier, uniforms of a certain cut had been worn by staff inside the same facility, dark, heavy cloth, not unlike the description the inmate had given. The conversation was quiet, kept to the break room, and passed between shifts. For the inmate, the experience left its mark. He refused to return to that cell. Even after being relocated, he repeated that he had not imagined it. The figure had been real to him, present in the corner, standing silently through the night. The deputies did not forget either. The echoes of their boots on concrete in later rounds seemed different after that night. The clang of a closing cell door sometimes carried an edge they could not explain. And occasionally, when the tier grew too quiet, they thought they heard footsteps again, faint, deliberate, and not their own. By the end of the shift, the sergeant had completed his log. The entry was brief, professional, and without embellishment. It recorded the inmates shouting at 10:02 p.m., the deputy's initial flashlight checks, the sergeant's arrival, and the subsequent search of the cell. It noted the inmate's refusal to return and his relocation to holding. The final line read, "Inmate disturbance, hallucination suspected." On paper, the event was reduced to little more than procedure. But among those who had been present, it carried weight. The inmate's panic, the consistency of his description, and the cold draft in the sealed cell were remembered long after the log had been filed away. In the days that followed, the inmate was kept in another wing. He never returned to the cell where he claimed to have seen the figure. When asked again, his story did not change. He said the man in the uniform had been real, that he had stood in the corner without speaking, and that he would not have left even when officers entered. He insisted the figure had remained behind them, as visible to him as the bars themselves. For the deputies, the incident became part of conversation on later shifts. Both agreed the inmate's fear had been genuine. Both acknowledged feeling the unusual chill inside the cell. One admitted he could not explain the footsteps he had heard, echoing when no one else had been moving. The sergeant, though skeptical by habit, did not dismiss those details entirely. In his report, he had recorded only the tangible: locks checked, keys accounted for, cell searched, no findings. But privately, he admitted the draft had been strange. He had worked long enough inside those walls to know their usual climate. The jail trapped heat and moisture, not cold air. For a moment, standing in that narrow space, it had felt different. There was no follow-up investigation. No maintenance request revealed an explanation for airflow in a sealed stone cell. The incident ended as most disturbances did, quietly, absorbed into the routine of the jail. Yet its memory stayed alive, kept not in official paperwork, but in the retelling. Some of the staff pointed to history. Savannah was a city with a long past, marked by wars, encampments, and old ground repurposed over generations. The jail itself was said to sit near areas once tied to military activity. Stories had circulated before about footsteps in empty corridors, or the sound of cell doors rattling when no one was near. Most officers dismissed them as draft, settling stone, or imagination on long nights. But some, after hearing about the inmate's description, recalled the look of older uniforms once worn in the facility decades earlier. Heavy cloth, plain cut, dark in color, not far from what the inmate had described in his agitation. Among the rank and file, the cell soon carried a reputation. Deputies referred to it quietly as bad luck. New staff were told the story in fragments, often at the end of shifts when the building settled into silence. The details changed little in retelling. The shouting inmate, the locked cell, the uniformed figure only he could see, and the unexplained cold draft. For the sergeant, it was one more entry in a long career of strange moments that resisted easy categorization. He had logged it, secured the block, and moved on to the next duty. But he also knew that police work, whether in the streets or inside jail walls, sometimes left questions without resolution. Not every disturbance fit neatly into procedure. The official stance remained unchanged. The inmate had experienced a hallucination, brought on by stress, confinement, or imagination. That explanation was sufficient for records, but for those who had stood in the cell or listened to the inmate's unwavering description, it was less easily dismissed. In the years that followed, the story lingered. The jail continued its routines. Cells filled and emptied. Deputies came and went. But the memory of that night in 1963 stayed with those who had been there. It was not marked in bold print or passed down in official briefings. Instead, it lived in the margins, mentioned in quiet conversations, remembered on nights when drafts cut through sealed corridors, or when the echo of footsteps seemed too sharp, too deliberate, to be dismissed as settling stone. The cell itself remained in use. Inmates came and went, most without incident, yet some staff swore it always felt colder than the others. They joked about it in passing, but the unease beneath the humor was real. The inmate's description: a man in an old uniform who would not speak, only stare, became the detail most often recalled. Officers who had heard the account repeated it years later, surprised at how clearly they remembered his words. The record books closed the incident in a single line, but the lived memory of it remained open-ended, a reminder that not everything inside those stone walls could be explained by keys, locks, and procedure. And so, the Chatham County Jail carried its story forward. Officially, it was nothing more than an inmate disturbance. Unofficially, it was one of those cases that sat quietly in the background of the job. A moment when trained officers felt a chill that had no place, heard sounds that had no source, and faced the insistence of a man who swore he was not alone in a cell that could not have held anyone else. It was just past 1 a.m. in the San Pedro district of Los Angeles, 1958. The port lay wrapped in a cool marine layer, the air carrying a faint salt tang from the harbor. Thin strands of fog drifted across intersections and clung to the asphalt, muting the glow of street lamps until they were little more than pale halos in the mist. For an officer on night patrol, the environment was familiar, but never entirely comfortable. Visibility narrowed, and sound carried strangely, bending in from the docks or vanishing into the fog. At such an hour, the city felt like it belonged less to the living than to the harbor itself, a place in constant motion, even if the streets seemed still. The officer assigned to this stretch of San Pedro had been with the department for 7 years. He was not a rookie, and not a man prone to exaggeration. Colleagues described him as steady, reliable, and calm under pressure. His beat carried the ordinary hazards of a port district in the late 1950s. Stolen goods moving through warehouses, occasional fights between longshoremen, cars left abandoned in alleys, sometimes hiding more than they revealed. His duty was to keep watch and to keep order, alone in his cruiser for most of the night. On this shift, he had settled into the usual rhythm. Slow passes down near empty streets, pausing at intersections to sweep with his spotlight, noting doors and gates left ajar, marking down license plates of parked vehicles. The low rumble of distant cargo ships bled into the silence, punctuated by the occasional moan of a foghorn echoing off the water. Inside the patrol car, the hum of the engine and the crackle of the radio were constant companions, reminders that while the city appeared empty, the work never really stopped. At 1:07 a.m., his routine broke in an unexpected way. Over the radio, he reported that another officer had flagged him down on foot. It was unusual. Patrols in this district were almost always conducted by vehicle, especially at this hour. The figure had appeared near a dimly lit intersection close to the docks, where the glow of a single street lamp cut only a shallow circle through the fog. According to the officer's later description, the man wore a standard LAPD uniform, peaked cap, dark jacket, badge catching a glint of light. His voice, calm and professional, carried a tone the reporting officer immediately recognized as that of a colleague. There was no hesitation in how he presented himself, no sense of uncertainty or strangeness, just an officer giving a quick, direct instruction. The walking officer pointed him toward a warehouse lot only a few blocks away. There, he said, a suspicious sedan had been left parked, trunk slightly ajar. It might be nothing, but it warranted a check. The patrolman acknowledged the direction, radioed his contact, and turned his cruiser down the suggested route. He did not doubt the exchange. The man looked and sounded like any other officer working the district. If anything, it seemed fortunate. An extra set of eyes on a quiet but potentially problematic corner. As the cruiser rolled forward, its headlights pushed through the fog in two narrow cones, catching glistening patches of wet pavement. The officer kept his speed low, mindful of how quickly shapes appeared and disappeared at the edge of vision. Small warehouses and storage sheds lined the streets, some secured behind chain-link fencing, others open to the street. The environment was silent except for the hum of the car and the faint hiss of tires on damp asphalt. Even by the standards of night patrol, the scene felt unusually subdued, as if the fog itself had dampened the district into stillness. Within minutes, the warehouse lot came into view. A faded metal gate hung half open, squeaking slightly as the night breeze shifted it. Beneath one of the few working lamps on the property sat the car described. A lone sedan, angled slightly toward the fence, trunk lid not quite shut. The light above flickered once, then steadied, leaving the vehicle half in shadow. No figures stood nearby. No sound of movement came from the lot. The officer slowed, scanned the area, then parked his cruiser at an angle that gave him both cover and a clear line of sight. First assessment was by the book. He ran the plates through dispatch. The reply came quickly, not reported stolen. On its face, the car could have been an ordinary vehicle left by a worker or resident. But the trunk lid bothered him. A slightly open trunk in a deserted lot was rarely innocent, especially near the port, where stolen goods often moved in and out under cover of night. He stepped from the cruiser, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam across the surrounding pavement. Damp asphalt reflected the light back, but there were no footprints visible, no sign that anyone had approached or left recently. The fog hung low around the fence line, drifting in thin curtains between the lampposts. Each sweep of the flashlight cut a sharper boundary through the haze, revealing corrugated metal siding, stacked pallets, and the uneven surface of the lot. Nothing stirred. The air smelled faintly of diesel and sea salt, the typical blend for this part of San Pedro. No other vehicles passed on the nearby street. He was alone with the sedan and with the instruction that had led him here. At 1:10 a.m., he called in for backup. His voice carried the steady tone of routine, but he included details about the contact. He mentioned the officer on foot, mid-30s, uniformed, badge glinting, calm and professional. He said the man had directed him here and that the sedan appeared to match the description. For a moment, the desk sergeant on the other end was quiet, as though noting the oddity but holding off comment until more units arrived. A second car, staffed with 2 officers covering an adjacent beat, was dispatched to his location. In the minutes before they arrived, the solo officer remained near the car, circling at a safe distance, watching for any sign of movement. His flashlight caught the chrome details on the trunk, the faint sheen of moisture settling on the roof, the faint line where the lid failed to close completely. He considered whether to open it immediately, but procedure and caution argued against it. Better to wait until backup was on scene, in case the situation proved more complicated than it appeared. By 1:14 a.m., headlights cut through the fog from the main street. The backup unit slowed, then turned into the lot, their tires crunching softly on gravel. The 2 officers stepped out, taking in the scene. They glanced at the sedan, then at their colleague, before one of them asked about the walking officer who had flagged him down. The solo patrolman repeated his description. Uniform, cap, badge glint, professional tone. He spoke with certainty, as though still seeing the man clearly in his memory. His colleagues exchanged a quick look. They had seen no one on approach. The streets leading here had been empty, but they set the thought aside for the moment, focusing on the vehicle before them. The lot was silent, the fog pressing close. 3 officers now stood around a car with an open trunk, and the faint, unanswered question of who had sent them there in the first place lingered in the air. The moment the backup officers stepped into the lot, the quiet of the district seemed to grow heavier. Their flashlights cut long arcs through the fog, sweeping past the sedan, catching edges of chain-link fencing and glinting off metal siding. The damp ground absorbed their footsteps, leaving only muted echoes as they moved. One of the men crouched briefly near the car, eyeing the trunk lid without touching it. The other looked at their colleague with a raised brow, waiting for him to clarify once more what had brought him here. The solo officer explained again, his voice steady but insistent. He had not stumbled on the sedan by chance. A man, another officer in full uniform, had flagged him down only minutes earlier. He described him clearly: mid-30s, average build, peaked cap angled properly, badge catching the glow of a street lamp. His voice had been calm, direct, and unmistakably professional. The kind of tone every officer came to recognize quickly, trained to cut through noise and confusion. There had been no uncertainty in the exchange, no moment where the patrolman doubted that this was anything but a fellow officer giving directions. The backup pair exchanged another look. They had seen no one walking these streets, and in this district, especially at this hour, it would have been hard for a man in uniform to vanish without a trace. Still, they accepted the account for now. The sedan stood before them, and it was their job to secure the scene. Procedure came first, questions second. They began with a closer visual inspection of the car. The plates, already run, came back clean. No immediate signs of forced entry or damage were visible from the outside. The trunk, slightly ajar, drew the most attention. The solo officer explained why he had not yet opened it. Caution, and the need for backup before potentially disturbing evidence or triggering a dangerous confrontation. The others nodded. It was the right call. Together, they circled the vehicle once more, beams crossing and doubling back. No figure appeared from the fog. No sound of hurried footsteps retreated down the alleys. The lot remained silent, almost oppressively so. By 1:17 a.m., the decision was made to expand their focus outward. The three officers split briefly, moving into the surrounding alleys and narrow lanes between warehouses. Their flashlights swept across stacked pallets, corrugated walls, and metal gates. Each step was accompanied by the creak of loose hinges or the hollow rattle of chain-link fencing catching the breeze. The fog distorted distance, making near sounds seem farther, and far-off sounds vanish abruptly. The only reliable noise was the scuff of their boots and the occasional call over the radio confirming position. The solo officer returned several times to the image of the man who had directed him here. In his mind, the details stayed sharp, the uniforms cut, the badge reflecting just enough light to catch his eye, the even tone of his voice. It had felt entirely routine, the way one officer might brief another in passing before moving on to a different task. There had been no odd mannerisms, no sense of unease in the moment. Yet now, with empty streets stretching in every direction, the memory pressed harder. How could someone so clear, so deliberate, simply vanish? At 1:24 a.m., one of the backup officers called in a status update. The desk sergeant's reply came with a pause. No foot patrols were assigned to the San Pedro district that night. Every officer was accounted for on vehicle assignments or desk duty. There was no one, not a single man, who matched the description the solo officer had given. The radio line carried a brief silence before the sergeant repeated the confirmation. Whoever had been standing in that intersection, wearing a uniform and giving instructions, was not a recognized member of the department. The confirmation rippled through the lot like a quiet chill. The two backup officers turned their attention back to their colleague. He held firm, insisting on what he had seen. This had not been fatigue or a half glimpse in fog. The man had stopped him directly, looked him in the eye, and spoken with a confidence that left no doubt. He shook his head when told no one was unaccounted for, unwilling to dismiss the contact as anything less than genuine. The search of the area continued. They moved systematically through the alleys, checking shadowed corners, peering behind storage crates, and shining beams across the edges of the dock. Each time, the result was the same. Nothing. No footprints in the damp surface, no movement in the fog. Just the quiet roll of mist, the occasional metallic groan of shifting gates, and the distant murmur of the harbour. The absence itself became its own presence, pressing on them with each empty sweep. By 1:30 a.m., they returned to the sedan. The trunk, still hanging open, demanded attention. Flashlights angled down, beams spilling across the seam where lid met frame. The senior of the backup officers took position on one side, the solo officer on the other. On a nod, the lid was lifted fully. Inside, neatly arranged but unmistakable, was an assortment of burglary tools: pry bars, bolt cutters, a slim jim, gloves, items common enough in isolation, but together leaving little doubt as to their intended purpose. The discovery shifted the tone. What had seemed like an odd report now carried tangible weight. The car was no abandoned vehicle of a dock worker. It was preparation for a crime, possibly a string of them. The trunk's contents turned speculation into evidence and procedure into action. The car was ordered impounded, photographs taken, reports noted. Yet even as they secured the tools, the question of how they had been led here remained. The solo officer returned again to his insistence. The man had been real. He had not imagined him, and he had not mistaken some passerby for a colleague. The uniform had been precise, the badge authentic in its reflection, the manner entirely consistent with trained police bearing. He could not accept, even in the face of his colleagues, and doubt that no such officer had been present. The certainty in his voice was as firm as when he first radioed in, steady and unshaken. The others acknowledged his conviction, but remained cautious. They had never seen the figure, never caught so much as a shadow on approach. To them, the possibility of an impersonator, a man dressed as an officer, perhaps scouting the area himself, was more plausible. Yet if that were the case, where had he gone? And why direct them to the car, practically handing over evidence that could lead to serious charges? An impersonator's purpose would more likely be avoidance, not cooperation. The logic held no easy answer. By 1:41 a.m., the lot had become a place of contradiction. Evidence of crime sat in the trunk of a car, indisputable and actionable. Yet the means by which it was discovered rested entirely on an encounter that, according to records, could not have occurred. The officers moved through the steps, cataloguing, securing, preparing the tow, but each action carried a subtle weight of unease. Even procedure could not clear the fog that hung over the night, both literal and figurative. The desk sergeant checked in again, repeating the same confirmation. No foot patrols, all units accounted for, no missing uniforms reported. The phrase unknown subject began to settle as the likely report category, but it did little to explain the clarity of the description or the conviction of the officer who had given it. His colleagues noted the certainty in his face, the quiet unease, yes, but never doubt. He knew what he had seen, and he could not shake it. The minutes stretched on as they completed their sweep. At 1:55 a.m., the decision was made to clear the scene. The sedan was in custody, its tools secured, the lot rechecked with no further findings. The officers gathered near their cruisers, radios crackling with brief exchanges as they closed the call. The fog still drifted across the lot, wrapping the scene in the same damp stillness as before. The intersection where the phantom officer had first appeared stood empty, the street lamp glowing dimly over an untouched patch of pavement. As the patrol cars pulled away, the unease lingered. For the solo officer, the image of the man remained sharp, the cap, the badge glint, the steady tone of voice. For the others, the night carried the unanswered tension of an account they could not confirm but could not disprove. And for the department, the case file would carry both sets of facts: burglary tools discovered, car impounded, and an unexplained encounter that defied its own records. The fog rolled back across the streets as the cruisers disappeared into the distance, leaving the port as quiet as before. What had begun as a simple patrol ended with evidence of crime and the shadow of a man who should not have been there at all. By the end of the shift, the incident was logged in the usual way: time, location, responding officers, vehicle impounded, burglary tools recovered. Yet tucked into the narrative was an entry far from ordinary. Contact with unknown subject, possibly impersonator. It was the official way of putting into words something that did not fit neatly into a report. The record reflected procedure, but it couldn't capture the unease that carried through every line. The internal review began with practical questions. Could the man have been an impersonator? Los Angeles was no stranger to people posing as authority figures, though rarely with such precision. To appear in the exact uniform, complete with badge and correct demeanor, was possible but unlikely. Department-issued gear was tracked closely, and while pieces occasionally went missing, full sets were difficult to acquire. No reports of lost or stolen equipment surfaced in the weeks that followed, nor was any arrest made of a suspect known to impersonate officers. The theory remained on the table. but it lacked substance. Another explanation pointed to fatigue or misinterpretation. A lone officer, past midnight, in fog, might mistake a passerby for a colleague. Stress and low visibility could play tricks, sharpening details that were never truly there. But those who knew the patrolman doubted this. He was seasoned, steady, and not prone to flights of imagination. His description was clear and consistent, repeated without hesitation. Mid-30s, uniform crisp, cap angled, badge glint visible under a street lamp, voice calm and professional. He never wavered on the specifics, and he never softened his certainty. To him, the figure had been as real as any partner standing beside him. The burglary tools added another layer of difficulty. Without them, the report might have been brushed aside as a moment of fatigue or confusion. But the sedan, trunk ajar, filled with instruments of theft, was very real. It turned the chance encounter into a lead that mattered. The tools suggested planning, possibly tied to a series of thefts under investigation in the Port District. Had the car been missed, those tools might have been put to use before morning. The phantom officer, whoever he was, had directed attention to a genuine crime in progress. Theories swirled among officers in the days after. Some wondered if the figure might have been a criminal himself, disguised in uniform, and then slipping away once the car was discovered. Yet why point directly to evidence that could lead to his own capture? Others speculated he might have been a bystander who happened to have access to a uniform, though again, the motive was unclear. A man going to such lengths would not ordinarily vanish without reason. The mystery resisted simple answers. Around the precinct, the case took on a quieter life of its own. Officers spoke of it in low tones, not as an official matter, but as a story passed during late shifts. Some half joked that the phantom officer might have been one of their own, long gone, still watching over the port. San Pedro carried its share of local lore, with longshoremen sometimes whispering about figures moving in fog, glimpsed and gone without trace. Most dismissed those tales as the product of fatigue, shadows, and the strange tricks mist can play on the eyes. But when a veteran patrolman insisted he had spoken directly to one, the weight of the story changed. The desk sergeant who handled the radio that night remained firm in his confirmation. Every unit was accounted for. No officer matched the description. The records left no gaps. He repeated it often when asked. There had been no one walking that beat, no one who should have been there to flag down a cruiser. His certainty matched that of the officer in the field, and together they formed a contradiction the file could not resolve. In the years that followed, the incident lingered as an example often raised when officers spoke about the unpredictability of San Pedro nights. The district's history of smuggling and dockside theft had always carried an air of secrecy and unease. Strange sights in the fog were not unusual, but rarely did they lead directly to evidence. That detail, the burglary tools in the trunk, remained the sharp edge of the case. It kept the story from fading into rumor, anchoring it in something solid, even as its source drifted into mystery. Some of the younger officers, hearing the account secondhand, framed it as a kind of warning. Not every detail of a call can be explained, but what matters is following through, checking, and documenting. Others carried it differently, seeing in it a strange reassurance that sometimes unseen forces seem to nudge events in a useful direction, whether by chance, impersonation, or something less definable. The officers had been led to stop a crime before it began. The solo officer himself never recanted. In later years, when asked, he repeated the same description, the same account. His certainty never softened. To him, the phantom officer was not a shadow, not a trick of the fog, and not a mistake. He had spoken to a colleague, taken directions, and acted on them. The fact that no record supported this did not alter his memory. He stood by it, long after the file had been closed and the car forgotten. The official record remained unchanged. Unknown subject, possibly impersonator. It was the language of paperwork, a phrase meant to hold a space where clarity could not be reached. Yet the weight of the story lingered in ways paperwork could not capture. In roll calls and late-night patrols, the story surfaced, usually framed as a curiosity, but always carrying a quiet respect. The case was remembered not for its unsolved element, but for the officer's insistence, his calm conviction that he had spoken to someone who was not supposed to exist. San Pedro in the 1950s remained a place of shifting fog, silent docks, and the constant presence of the harbour. For those who worked its streets at night, the boundary between the ordinary and the unexplained was never as solid as it seemed. On that night in 1958, a patrolman followed clear, precise directions from a man in uniform. The man vanished without trace, yet the lead brought them to evidence that mattered. Between procedure and mystery, the case found its balance. A report that closed officially, and a story that never quite did. The final note of the file was short, matter-of-fact, and unresolved. A car impounded, tools secured, no subject located, contact with unknown individual, case cleared. And yet, for those who were there, the memory never cleared so easily. It remained, carried quietly through years of patrols and retellings, as sharp in the mind of the man who first reported it as the glint of a badge under a street lamp in the fog. In the early hours of an autumn night in 1992, the outskirts of Krakow lay under a damp and uneasy stillness. The clock edged past 2 in the morning, and the roads leading away from the city centre were nearly empty. A thin drizzle had fallen earlier, leaving the asphalt slick and reflective. Low fog rolled in uneven patches from the nearby riverbanks, drifting across open ground, sliding between tree lines, and gathering at the edges of abandoned yards. For anyone outside, the air carried a sharp chill, heavy with the smell of wet earth and cold metal. It was the kind of night when silence seemed deeper than usual, broken only by occasional sounds carried strangely through the mist. The distant bark of a dog, the faint rumble of a passing lorry on a highway several kilometers away, or the single echo of dripping water hitting concrete. For 2 police officers on routine patrol, the setting was both familiar and unpredictable. Nothing might happen at all, or something might present itself suddenly out of the dark. The patrol car moved slowly down one of the suburban access roads, its headlights sweeping across overgrown verges and long stretches of chain-link fencing that marked the boundary of an old industrial complex. Inside the car sat a pair of officers with different levels of experience, balanced by routine familiarity. The sergeant, riding passenger, had more than a decade of service. 12 years on the force had made him pragmatic, steady, and not quick to jump at shadows. He had dealt with vandals, thieves, drunk drivers, and more serious offenders over the years, but he carried a reputation for measured judgment. At the wheel was a constable, only 3 years into the job. Still learning the rhythms of night patrols, he relied heavily on his partner's calm approach. He knew the area well enough. Abandoned factories and storage yards were common across the outskirts, especially after the economic changes of the early 1990s left many sites unused. Trespassing was common, sometimes for scavenging scrap metal, sometimes for less innocent reasons, Neither officer expected anything more unusual than that. The night's patrol had been quiet until 2:07 a.m., when they turned off the main road and onto the cracked pavement leading deeper into the industrial zone. As the cruiser rounded a bend, the constable slowed. In the distance, through the mist, a faint white light flickered inside one of the derelict warehouses. Both men noticed it at once. It was sharp against the otherwise unbroken dark, glowing from behind a shattered window pane before vanishing, then returning a few seconds later. The sergeant leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. A trespasser with a torch was the first and most reasonable assumption. Lights inside abandoned structures rarely meant anything else. He instructed the constable to roll in carefully, keeping speed low, so they could observe without drawing too much attention. The cruiser's tires hissed over damp gravel, and the fog thickened as they moved closer. Then, without warning, their headlights swept across a shape directly in front of them. A tall figure, walking slowly from one side of the road to the other, dressed in what looked like a long coat that hung below the knees. The constable braked sharply, heart jumping as the beams illuminated the form for only a second. The figure disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the mist. Both officers looked ahead at the roadside where it had stepped off. There was nothing there. The sergeant, not easily rattled, ordered the car to stop fully. He opened his door, stepping out into the cold, damp air. His flashlight beam cut through the fog, slicing across patches of grass, then the rough gravel surface at the edge of the road. No movement. The constable joined him, sweeping his own beam in widening arcs. They expected to see a person moving away, but the light revealed only wet ground and tangled weeds. The drizzle had left the surface damp enough that fresh prints should have been visible, but the gravel showed nothing distinct. By 2:13 a.m., both officers stood in silence at the roadside. The flickering light inside the warehouse had gone out. The figure they had both seen clearly for a second was absent, leaving behind no trace. Neither man spoke much in that moment, but the sergeant made a decision. He instructed the constable to circle the cruiser closer to the warehouse. If intruders were inside, they needed to deal with it directly. If someone had slipped into the fog, they had to be accounted for. As they pulled up to the front of the structure, the full state of the building revealed itself. The warehouse loomed like a shell, its exterior panels rusting through, windows shattered, and a wide set of sliding doors held shut with a chain. In the wind, the metal creaked and rattled, the sound echoing faintly through the mist. Small pools of water had formed where the pavement dipped. The air smelled faintly of oil and rust, a reminder of machinery that had long since been removed. The sergeant stepped out again, flashlight in hand, and walked toward the main doors. His beam caught on the metal links of the chain, confirming they were still in place. No obvious sign of entry, no break in the lock. Yet the image of that flickering white light remained vivid. If it hadn't come from a torch, what else could it have been? The constable scanned the gravel yard. His breath hung in front of him as the cold seemed sharper here than on the road. He thought briefly about the figure crossing in front of their headlights, the way it had appeared solid for that one moment. He was certain he had seen it. The sergeant had too, yet it had left nothing behind. At 2:18 a.m., the sergeant reached for his radio. His voice came through steady as he requested a second unit for support. The call was routine in form, but he included the detail of suspicious lights observed, possible intruders in the warehouse. The control room acknowledged dispatching a nearby patrol to assist. Estimated arrival time, 5 to 7 minutes. While they waited, both officers stayed near the warehouse yard. They did not enter, not without support, but they kept their flashlights trained on the building, listening carefully. The fog drifted slowly past, breaking apart as beams cut through it, reforming in patches. At one point, the constable thought he heard a faint metallic rattle deeper inside, though he could not confirm it. The sergeant raised a hand for silence, listening as well. For a moment, nothing followed. The warehouse stood still. The minutes stretched thin, marked only by the faint hum of the cruiser's engine left idling nearby. The mist shifted again, and the lot seemed to close in around them. Both men kept their attention fixed forward, waiting for backup. At 2:24 a.m., the quiet of the yard broke with a sound that made both men tense. From inside the warehouse came a metallic bang, sharp and resonant, as though a heavy sheet of steel had been struck with force. It echoed through the interior, bouncing off unseen walls before fading back into silence. A few seconds later, another noise followed, not as loud, but distinct. A muffled shout, brief, cut off almost immediately. Both officers turned toward the doors at once. The sergeant motioned to his partner, his expression changing from patient caution to a firm readiness. Their earlier suspicions seemed confirmed. Intruders inside, perhaps vandals, perhaps someone scrapping metal in the night. Whatever the case, the building was no longer just an empty shell. It held someone. The sergeant radioed in the update. Noises heard, voices possible, entry to be made. The dispatcher acknowledged, repeating that backup was on the way. But in the moment, the sergeant weighed the risk. If there were trespassers, they could be gone before support arrived. If someone was injured or in distress, waiting could cost time. Decision made, he signaled for the constable to ready his flashlight and baton. Together, they approached the wide sliding doors, chains rattling faintly in the night breeze. At 2:27 a.m., they entered. The lock was not as secure as it first seemed. The chain looped loosely, allowing a narrow gap between the doors. With effort, they forced it wide enough to slip through. The interior greeted them with darkness, dust, and the smell of old machinery long since removed. Their flashlight beams sliced across broken crates, discarded pipes, and scattered debris littering the concrete floor. Immediately, both officers noticed something unusual. The air inside was colder than outside. Their breaths condensed more visibly, curling into faint clouds that drifted and dissolved. The sergeant paused, noting the sharp difference. Drafts could explain it, he thought. Old buildings often held pockets of colder air, but the drop was so sudden that it stood out even to his seasoned sense of judgment. As they advanced, beams shifting methodically, the warehouse revealed itself as a cavernous space. Rows of support columns stretched into the distance, shadows cast in alternating patterns as the lights moved. Rust streaked the walls, and flakes of paint curled downward from the ceiling. Every sound they made, boots scraping against concrete, gears shifting on belts, echoed strangely, carrying further than expected. Then came the next noise. A set of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, reverberated from deeper inside. The sound was steady, measured, as though someone was walking purposefully away from them. Both men froze, listening. The steps continued for several seconds, then faded, swallowed into the vastness of the structure. Their flashlights swept across the space in unison, but nothing moved. No shape retreated into the shadows, no figure appeared between the columns. The sound was there, but the source was not. The constable whispered, almost involuntarily, that he had heard them clearly. The sergeant, gave a curt nod. He had too. Yet the absence of anyone visible made the moment difficult to reconcile. Still, procedure carried them forward. They advanced cautiously, moving in wide arcs to cover blind corners. The echo of their own movements made every pause feel amplified, as if the building itself was replaying their presence back at them. For several minutes, they pushed deeper. Each time they stopped, the silence seemed heavier, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere overhead. Their flashlight beams revealed dust untouched in places, cobwebs stretched across broken windows, and small mounds of debris where plaster had fallen. Nowhere did they see the fresh disturbance that should have followed living movement. At 2:33 a.m., the sound of tires rolling across gravel reached their ears. The backup unit had arrived. 2 officers stepped into the yard outside, their flashlights cutting through the mist as they made their way toward the entrance. Relief mingled with a renewed sense of purpose. With 4 men now present, the building could be searched more thoroughly. Together, they swept the warehouse methodically. Each officer took a section, beams crossing, voices low but coordinated. They checked rooms along the perimeter, staircases leading to upper platforms, and narrow storage corridors still cluttered with rusted barrels and crates. At each turn, they expected to find someone crouched, hiding, or fleeing. At each turn, they found nothing. By 2:40 a.m., the sweep was concluded negative. No intruders, no footprints on the dusty floor, no fresh signs of human presence. The banging noises and the muffled shout had left no evidence behind. The footsteps, so clearly heard, belonged to no one they could find. The sergeant called the result in. Voice clipped, but professional. Negative contact, no suspects located. As they regrouped outside, the damp air pressed close again. The 4 men stood near their vehicles, discussing next steps. The sergeant considered another pass through the building, but weighed it against the absence of evidence. He was leaning toward clearing when something else occurred. From the radios in both patrol cars came a sudden burst of static. Loud, crackling, it filled the night for several seconds, far stronger than ordinary interference. All 4 men turned instinctively toward the sound. The microphones were untouched. No officer had keyed a transmission. Yet through the static faintly, there seemed to be a voice, garbled, indistinct, but human-like. A few syllables rose above the distortion before vanishing into silence. The sergeant stepped closer, leaning into the car to check the unit. The constable did the same. Both found the radios operating normally. No sign of fault, no explanation for why they had broadcast without input. The backup officers confirmed they had heard the same, static, then fragments of voice, then nothing. The air afterward seemed even more silent than before, as if the noise had left a vacuum in its wake. The incident tipped the balance. With no intruders found, no fresh evidence, and now unexplained interference, the sergeant made the call. The search was over. At 2:44 a.m., he instructed all units to clear the scene. Reports would be filed, the building noted for further checks, but there was nothing more to hold them there. The officers returned to their cars, engines starting, headlights pushing beams through the mist once more. The convoy rolled slowly down the access road, the warehouse receding into darkness behind them. Tension began to ease, but at 2:50 a.m., as they neared the tree line at the edge of the industrial zone, the night offered one last detail. The headlights of the lead car swept across a silhouette standing near the trees. It lasted only a second, just long enough for both sergeant and constable to register a human-like form at the edge of the beam. The driver braked, bringing the car to a halt. The second unit stopped behind. All 4 officers stepped out, flashlights raised, beams converging on the spot. The tree line revealed nothing. No figure, no movement, only fog shifting between trunks. They searched the ground, checked the roadside, and called out into the woods. Silence answered. Whatever had been there was gone, leaving the officers with only the fleeting image still in their minds. By 2:55 a.m., the decision was final. The scene was clear. The shift would continue. Both units drove away, leaving the mist, the warehouse, and the unanswered questions behind. By the time both units returned to their patrol areas, the night had regained its earlier stillness. The fog lingered, the drizzle returned briefly, and the roads once more looked deserted. But the officers carried with them a tension that didn't fade so easily. Their reports would be filed in the language of procedure, but the memory of the incident refused to sit neatly on paper. At the precinct, the sergeant logged the events with his usual professionalism. The entry read, "Suspicious activity observed. Warehouse checked. Negative contact." Additional notes included the flickering light, the noises heard, the muffled shout, and the unexplained burst of radio static. The roadside figure, fleeting and untraceable, was written as unconfirmed visual, possible misidentification due to fog. The sergeant knew the importance of precise wording. Reports were not places for speculation. They recorded what was observed, nothing more. Still, the details stood out. A sighting of a person in long coat across the road, 2 officers seeing it simultaneously, metallic bangs from inside a locked structure, a muffled voice that both men agreed sounded human, footsteps receding where no one was found, and the radios, devices both cars relied on, erupting in static and producing voice-like sounds without being keyed. Each detail, taken on its own, could be rationalized. Together, they formed a sequence that resisted easy explanation. The following day, the warehouse was inspected in daylight. Sunlight exposed rust, broken windows, and debris in clearer terms. Dust coated the interior, thick enough to hold impressions had anyone been moving inside. None were found. No footprints, no fresh disturbances. The lock remained intact, the chain unbroken. The building stood as it had for months, silent, unused, neglected. The sergeant returned with the constable to walk the perimeter. In daylight, the structure looked less imposing, but no less puzzling. They found no traces of trespassers, no evidence of forced entry, and no signs that anyone had been inside at all. If someone had been, they had left no mark. The report was updated. Day recheck negative. Theories circulated quietly among the men who had been there. The most practical explanation suggested actual trespassers had slipped away unseen. Perhaps youths with a torch, or scavengers trying to strip metal. The noises and the shout might have been them fleeing, while the officers advanced from the opposite side. The problem was the lack of footprints, the absence of signs, and the persistence of sounds when no one was visible. Another possibility was acoustics. Old warehouses carried sound strangely. A clanging door in one section could echo like it was nearby. A shout outside could bounce through metal corridors until it seemed internal. Even footsteps, some argued, might have been their own, rebounding off surfaces in confusing ways. The sergeant acknowledged this explanation in part, but remained uneasy about the clarity of what they had heard. The radios, too, raised questions. Interference was not unheard of, especially in areas with heavy industrial infrastructure, though most equipment there had been defunct for years. Signals could sometimes cross, bleeding in from other frequencies. but the timing was unusual, and the impression of a garbled voice through the static stayed with each man. None could claim to understand it fully. The constable, less experienced but sharp in observation, brought up the figure on the road. He admitted visibility had been poor, but he was certain of what he had seen: a tall silhouette in a long coat crossing before the headlights. The sergeant had seen it too, enough to call a stop, yet they had found nothing at the roadside. In the report, it became a cautious line about fog and low visibility. Privately, it remained a stubborn detail neither could dismiss. Over the following weeks, the story travelled among colleagues. Officers on other shifts listened with interest, some sceptical, others quietly thoughtful. It became known in shorthand as the warehouse incident, or more often, simply the haunted beat. The road by the complex earned the nickname among patrolmen, a way of marking it as a place where routine expectations gave way to unanswered questions. For some, it was little more than a curiosity. Long nights bred stories, and stories needed settings. An abandoned industrial site fit the role perfectly. But for those who had been there, the account carried more weight. They had shared the sights and sounds. They had compared their impressions in real time. This was not a single man's memory, but the overlap of several, all noting the same things at the same moments. That made it harder to dismiss. In Krakow itself, stories of strange encounters were not new. The city and its outskirts were layered with folklore. Tales tied to wartime executions, deserted buildings, and wooded paths. Industrial ruins, especially those left idle after the early 1990s transitions, often became settings for such accounts. Locals spoke of shapes moving in fog, lights appearing briefly, voices echoing through walls of structures long abandoned. Officers, pragmatic by training, typically set such stories aside. But when experience pressed them into similar situations, the line between folklore and fieldwork blurred. Privately, some officers speculated on causes. Stress and fatigue were common enough on night shifts, and minds could play tricks. Mist could distort light, cold drafts could mimic sudden changes in atmosphere, and faulty equipment could produce static. Each explanation worked for part of the story, yet not for all of it. That was what lingered. The way the details fit together without fitting into reason. The sergeant himself remained consistent. In later years, when asked, he did not embellish and did not dramatize. He would say only that they had seen a figure, heard noises, and found nothing. His account was calm, precise, stripped of speculation. He did not call it anything beyond what it was, a night when events failed to match their outcomes. For the constable, the memory stayed sharper. He recalled the footsteps most clearly, the sense of presence moving just ahead, leading deeper into the building. He remembered the cold air hitting his face the moment he crossed the threshold, and he remembered the figure in the headlights, solid for 1 second, gone the next. For him, the experience was not easily rationalized, even years later. The case closed in paperwork as routine. A suspicious light observed, warehouse checked, negative results, nothing more. Yet in conversation, in the informal exchanges that moved between officers over cigarettes or during long patrol hours, it remained alive. The haunted beat became a reference point, a reminder that not every shift played out within the boundaries of logic. In the end, the incident settled into the quiet space between fact and memory. The facts were written in reports. Lights, noises, negative findings. The memories belonged to the men, shared, certain, but unresolved. The fog over the Krakow outskirts rolled back as it always did. The warehouse continued to decay, and patrols went on. But for those who had walked into its cold interior that night, there would always be the echo of footsteps that belonged to no one, and the faint voice buried in static that should not have been there at all. It was the middle of the afternoon in Dublin, sometime in 1976, when a standard prisoner transfer was scheduled to return an offender from district court back into Mountjoy prison. The air outside was unsettled, overcast, with a thin drizzle drifting down across the North Circular Road. The street was wet and reflective, its surface broken by the occasional passing car and the muted footsteps of pedestrians cutting quickly through the cool air. To most in the area, it was just another routine day. But for the prison officers involved, it would become one of the strangest calls they ever logged. Mountjoy Prison itself dominated the street, a fortress of stone with high walls that had stood for over a century. Its presence was both familiar and imposing to anyone living nearby. The prison's architecture had aged into something heavier than stone alone. It carried the weight of history, of riots and escapes, of men locked away during turbulent decades in Irish history. On this particular day, though, nothing suggested what was about to unfold. The schedule listed an intake of a single prisoner, a simple transfer carried out many times before. The officer in charge of the escort was a veteran sergeant, a man who had been in the service for roughly 14 years. He was regarded as steady, methodical, and accustomed to the rhythm of prison operations. By that stage in his career, there was little he hadn't already seen. Transfers, disturbances, attempts at resistance, all handled with a calm professionalism. On this assignment, he was joined by two younger Garda officers, both relatively new but competent. Their role was to provide the additional watch required when moving a convicted offender back into a secured facility. The prisoner himself had been processed at court, restrained with standard handcuffs, and loaded into the van for transport. Nothing unusual was noted in the paperwork. The man was neither known for violent outbursts nor for escape attempts. He had not caused any disturbance during the journey. By the time the van pulled through Mountjoy's outer gates at 3:42 p.m., the assignment was still running exactly on schedule. At the gate, the standard procedure was followed. The prisoner was logged by the gate officer, checked against the paperwork, and escorted into the intake area. The sounds of the street faded as the heavy outer gate closed, replaced by the more contained acoustics of the prison yard. The drizzle tapped faintly against the barred windows high above, a reminder of the weather pressing in on the city. Inside, the environment felt narrower, the air marked by the faint mix of disinfectant and damp stone. The escort party moved into the processing corridor. The formation was typical. One Garda slightly ahead, one behind, and the sergeant walking alongside, maintaining close proximity to the prisoner. It was a configuration designed to limit any chance of sudden movement or attempt at flight. All three officers later emphasized that the man was quiet, cooperative, and gave no indication of resistance. His pace matched theirs. His head was lowered slightly as they moved, footsteps squeaking against the wet linoleum. The corridor they entered was lit by fluorescent tubes, the kind that gave off a dim buzz and flickered at the edges. The sound of the heavy security gate closing behind them echoed briefly before the passage fell into its usual rhythm. The creak of boots, the faint clank of equipment, and the occasional murmur of distant voices carrying down from other parts of the facility. For the officers, these were normal markers of a routine transfer. The environment was controlled, familiar, and predictable. As they advanced toward the inner gate, the group reached a section of corridor that turned at an angle. The design of the passage created a momentary blind spot as they moved through it. At 3:49 p.m., they were negotiating this turn. The officers remained in formation, one slightly ahead, the prisoner in the middle, the sergeant and other Garda at his side and behind. In their later accounts, all three insisted there had been no shift in the man's weight, no attempt to pull away, no tug on the restraints. He was present one moment, moving with them as before, and then, as they rounded the corner, he was not. The realization came quickly. Within seconds, the sergeant halted and scanned the corridor. The Garda behind him confirmed that the prisoner was no longer visible. The one ahead turned sharply, expecting to see the man just steps behind. But the space between them was empty. The corridor was closed, the gates secured. The restrained prisoner they had been escorting had vanished from their formation in the span of only a few steps. At 3:51 p.m., the sergeant called for an immediate lockdown. The gates in the corridor were sealed, doors along the adjacent hallways were locked, and a rapid search began. Officers swept the intake office, the corridor itself, and the adjoining yard. No trace was found. The restraints had not been left behind. No doors were found open. Windows along the route were secured and showed no sign of tampering. The fluorescent hum continued above, and the faint sound of rain pressed against the walls, but the prisoner was nowhere inside. 5 minutes later, at 3:56 p.m., the first full sweep of the intake section was complete. The result was negative. Officers expanded the search, moving through other nearby areas of the holding wing. Again, nothing. By 4:08 p.m., the decision was made to conduct a full inmate count throughout Mountjoy. The possibility existed that the man had somehow slipped into another group of prisoners being moved, though officers considered it unlikely. The results came back clear. The convict was not inside the facility. By 4:15 p.m., the response extended outward. Garda patrols were sent to the perimeter, the surrounding streets and rooftops. The search widened, but no movement was seen, and no individual matching the man's description was spotted. The wet streets carried on with their afternoon traffic, unmarked by the chaos inside the walls. To the public, nothing unusual appeared to be happening at Mountjoy. But within, officers were confronted by a situation that defied their training. At 4:22 p.m., the escort sergeant gave his first formal statement. He was clear. The man had been walking steadily between them until they reached the corner. He had not felt any shift in pressure on the restraints, nor any sudden pull. Both Garda escorts separately confirmed the same. They had not looked away. They had not lost awareness of the man in the seconds before his disappearance. Yet when they checked, the space between them was empty. The gate officer, stationed at the intake post, reported that no one had passed through or attempted to force any doors. The search continued. At 4:40 p.m., a full facility alert was issued, something rarely done unless a major disturbance or confirmed escape was underway. Still, nothing was recovered. No signs of forced entry or exit were discovered. By 5 p.m., the officers involved were interviewed separately. Their accounts were consistent, aligning in every key detail. The prisoner had been present. He had been restrained. He had been escorted properly through the corridor. And then, without struggle, he was gone. The first stage of the incident ended not with resolution, but with absence. A man had entered Mountjoy Prison under escort. He had been logged, processed, and moved toward his holding cell. And then he was simply no longer there. The official record states that at 3:49 p.m., inside Mountjoy Prison's processing corridor, the escorted prisoner ceased to be physically present. The details of that record were entered matter-of-factly, but for those in the hallway, the reality was not so straightforward. The sergeant and 2 gardaí had walked the man from the outer gate. They had kept formation, and they had not broken contact. Yet, within a corridor designed to prevent escape, the individual was gone. The moments immediately following the disappearance were dominated by instinct and procedure. The sergeant barked an order for a halt and demanded confirmation. Both escorts scanned their sides, one looking toward the corridor ahead, the other doubling back on the steps they had just taken. Nothing was visible. The air carried only the buzz of the fluorescent lamps and the distant slam of another gate somewhere down the wing. The officers later recalled that the sound of their own boots squeaking on the linoleum seemed louder than usual, as if the absence of the prisoner had amplified every detail of the corridor itself. The lockdown call was the first decisive step. By 3:51 p.m., radio traffic spread the alert across the intake block. Gates were sealed electronically where possible. Keys were turned manually in others, and the chain of command moved swiftly. Every door within the relevant section was secured. Any chance that the man had slipped into a side room would, in theory, now be contained. The officers remained in position, holding the corridor until relief arrived. Their accounts were clear. There had been no rush of movement, no sudden sprint, no physical effort by the prisoner to break away. The initial sweep of the corridor was conducted within minutes. It covered the section of passage from the outer gate through to the corner where the incident occurred, as well as the connecting hallways. Each door was tested. Each lock was inspected. The intake office was cleared. The yard beyond the barred windows was checked from multiple angles. No physical presence was located. The sergeant was noted as calm but insistent, reiterating that the man had been walking with them, restrained, and then had not. At 3:56 p.m., a secondary sweep extended into adjoining spaces. More officers joined the effort. They moved with a practiced pace, covering each section in turn. They found no sign of tampering. Windows were barred and unmarked by tools. The floor showed only the usual damp scuffs from boots tracking in rainwater. Radios crackled with status updates, most of them negative. The air grew heavier with the recognition that a prisoner was missing and that the usual avenues of escape were closed. By 4:08 p.m., the decision was made to verify the wider inmate population. A count was initiated across the prison. Officers moved cell to cell, marking names against rosters. The missing man was not found among them. He had not blended into another group, nor had he been mistakenly logged twice. The paperwork confirmed his presence at intake but could not account for his absence after the corridor. Outside the prison walls, Garda patrols were deployed. By 4:15 p.m., units were searching the perimeter, rooftops, and surrounding streets. The drizzle continued to fall, leaving wet trails along gutters and pooling in depressions on the road. Officers scanned alleyways, side yards, and doorways. No one matching the prisoner's description was reported. Cars passed along North Circular Road, and pedestrians moved with umbrellas tilted against the wind, unaware that a facility-wide search was underway only yards from where they walked. Inside, the atmosphere remained tense but controlled. The fluorescent lights in the corridor cast a pale glow, and the sound of radios punctuated the silence. At 4:22 p.m., statements were taken from the escorting officers. Each repeated the same account. The man had been cooperative. He had walked steadily. The restraints were secure. He had not shown signs of resistance or hesitation. At the corner, he was suddenly no longer there. They emphasized that it had not been a matter of distraction. Their eyes had been on him, and yet his presence had ceased. The gate officer stationed at the intake post was questioned as well. He had not observed the moment directly, but confirmed that the corridor gates had remained secured at all times. No one had approached, no keys had been used, no locks tampered with. To him, the corridor had functioned as intended. By 4:40 p.m., the full facility alert expanded the scale of the operation. Additional staff were pulled into the search. Hallways, offices, storage areas, and service tunnels were cleared. The old prison had many passageways, some less used than others, but each was accounted for. Still, no individual in restraints was discovered. For those searching, the experience became increasingly surreal. A prisoner cannot simply vanish in a controlled corridor. Yet that was the working reality. Officers traced and retraced their steps. They tapped walls and checked barred windows. The linoleum still carried damp boot marks, but none could be distinguished as belonging to the missing man beyond the point where he was last seen. By 5 p.m., interviews with the involved officers were conducted separately, each statement aligned. The sergeant remained steady in his retelling. The two gardei, though younger, were equally consistent. They described the prisoner's posture, his quiet demeanor, the way he walked between them. They stressed the lack of any sudden movement or attempt to flee. Their words echoed one another, not rehearsed, but born of shared disbelief. The facility's command staff weighed possible explanations. A misperception. Unlikely, given 3 officers had witnessed the same progression. A momentary lapse in observation. Possible, but how would a man in restraints exploit that lapse in a corridor sealed at both ends? An error in paperwork. Again unlikely, since the gate officer had confirmed intake, and the man had been physically present with escorts. As the hours passed, no resolution emerged. The search of the prison grounds concluded with no findings. The surrounding streets produced nothing. The missing man was not logged at any hospital, police station, or nearby holding cell. He did not reappear later in the evening. The day ended with an official record stating escape, though no physical evidence supported that conclusion. Within the facility, discussions continued informally among staff. Some leaned on practical explanations, suggesting a momentary gap in awareness had allowed the prisoner to slip into an adjoining room, though this did not explain the lack of open doors. Others entertained less conventional ideas, noting that Mountjoy carried a reputation for unusual stories dating back decades. Whether folklore or simply the exaggerations that grow in closed institutions, tales of odd occurrences around the prison grounds were part of its history. The ghost escape, as it would later be called, fit uncomfortably into that tradition. The officers themselves stood by their accounts. The sergeant emphasized his years of experience and the absence of anything resembling negligence. The younger gardei insisted they had done their jobs precisely as trained. None were disciplined. The investigation concluded that procedures had been properly followed. The prisoner, nonetheless, remained unaccounted for. In the days that followed, the corridors returned to their usual routine. Prisoners were processed, officers stood post, and gates slammed shut as they always had. But for those who had been present that afternoon, the memory lingered. The sound of the fluorescent hum above the linoleum, the faint drizzle outside, and the brief blind spot of the corridor corner all became permanent markers of an unresolved event. Some officers privately admitted that they could not fully explain to themselves what they had witnessed. They had seen a man between them, in restraints, present in every sense of the word. They had moved as a group through the corridor, and yet, at the corner, the man was gone. No resistance, no sound, no sign, just absence. That absence became the defining feature of the incident. More than the paperwork, more than the reports, more than the follow-up investigation. It was the lived reality of a man's presence converting into emptiness in the space of seconds. It was, as some called it, a ghost escape, not because of supernatural conviction, but because the language of ordinary police reports could not quite contain it. The wider Gardaí continued to log the event as an escapee at large. Notices were circulated. Descriptions were passed to patrol units. Yet weeks later, no sighting was ever confirmed. The man did not reappear in Dublin or elsewhere. It was as if his presence at the intake gate had been the last confirmed moment of his record. For the prison staff, the case remained singular. Mountjoy had seen escapes, some elaborate, some violent, some daring. But every other case left traces. Broken locks, dug tunnels, smuggled tools, bribed guards. This case left none. A man who entered under escort simply did not arrive at his cell. The middle phase of the incident, from disappearance to extended search, occupied less than 2 hours in real time. Yet in recollection, it expanded endlessly. Officers described replaying the sequence in their minds, searching for the missing piece, the detail they might have overlooked. Each time, the conclusion was the same. The man was there, and then he was not. That paradox, simple but absolute, shaped the enduring strangeness of the event. It resisted neat categorization. It frustrated the instincts of those trained to explain through procedure and evidence. And it set the stage for the aftermath, the investigation, the theories, and the unanswered questions that followed. The official record closed the day of the disappearance with a single word: escape. It was the most practical label available. In prison operations, there are only so many classifications. A prisoner is either present or not. If not, the system treats it as escape. But among those who had been inside the corridor that afternoon, the word felt inadequate. An escape requires a method, a broken door, a cut restraint, a window forced open. Here, none of those existed. The man was gone, yet no path could be drawn. The internal review began immediately. Reports were collected from the escort sergeant, the 2 Gardaí, and the gate officer. The sequence of times was cross-checked against logs. At 3:42 p.m., the prisoner was confirmed at the gate. At 3:46 p.m., the group moved into the corridor. At 3:49 p.m., he was last seen. By 3:51 p.m., lockdown was ordered. In those minutes, no other movements were recorded. No other doors opened. The paperwork showed no discrepancy. The review board examined each potential point of failure. Could the restraints have been faulty? The officers stated that they had not felt any slack or sudden give. Could a hidden accomplice have opened a side door? None of the doors along that corridor had been tampered with. Their locks were intact. Could the officers have been distracted, even for a split second? Each denied it, and the alignment of their accounts suggested otherwise. No disciplinary action was taken. The review concluded that the escort team had followed procedure. The sergeant's record was clean. The Gardaí were considered competent. There was no evidence of negligence. The outcome was officially logged as unsolved escape. Outside of the paperwork, speculation spread quickly. Among prison staff, the event was retold as something outside the ordinary. Officers in later years called it the ghost escape, half in jest and half in acknowledgement that the details refused to resolve themselves. Mountjoy had seen many escapes before. In its long history, Prisoners had dug tunnels, scaled walls, and bribed guards. In 1973, a helicopter had even been used to lift men out of the yard. Each of those incidents left traces, physical evidence, reports of sightings, accounts of accomplices. In 1976, the disappearance in the corridor stood alone. A man walked in through the gate, but there was no record of him walking out. The Gardaí circulated notices to the public. Descriptions of the convict were shared with patrols, stations, and hospitals. Weeks passed. No sighting was confirmed. He did not resurface in Dublin. He was not located elsewhere in Ireland. No later arrest brought him back into custody. For a system built on tracking individuals through records and physical presence, it was as if he had ceased to exist beyond the intake gate. Within Mountjoy, stories circulated of earlier oddities. Some officers recalled tales of unexplained sounds in unused passages. Others mentioned old accounts of disappearances dating back decades, never formally recorded but passed along in conversation. These stories gained traction only in the absence of practical explanations. To some, they were folklore, nothing more. To others, they provided a framework, not for solving the case, but for living with it. For the escorting officers, the incident remained a personal marker in their careers. The sergeant maintained his account with consistency until retirement. He had spent more than a decade in service without incident, and he rejected any suggestion of negligence. The two younger Gardaí carried the memory forward, repeating the same details each time they were asked. Neither shifted in their descriptions. Neither offered a new explanation years later. Theories continued to be suggested. Some argued that the convict had used the brief blind spot at the corner to slip away, ducking into an adjacent space in the seconds before lockdown. But this left unanswered the problem of locked doors and secure windows. Others suggested that in the confusion, the officers might have miscounted, believing the man present when he had already broken away. But the timing of the logs contradicted this. He was seen at intake, walked with them into the corridor, and then ceased to be present. The absence of physical evidence created a vacuum that theories filled unevenly. None resolved the facts completely. The case remained, in the language of the Gardaí, open but inactive. There was nothing further to investigate, no leads, no sightings, no evidence. As years passed, the story became part of the prison's culture. New officers heard it from veterans. The corner of the corridor was pointed out to recruits. It became a place where routine procedure had failed in a way that could not be diagrammed or written into training manuals. The phrase "ghost escape" was used more casually, but it carried the weight of an official unsolved disappearance. By the 1980s, the event had already become legend. In the 1990s, it was still repeated in staff rooms, half warning, half mystery. Decades later, the incident remained in conversations about Mountjoy's strangest moments. In context, the disappearance occurred during a turbulent period for Dublin. Crime rates were high, the prison population was rising, officers were stretched thin, escapes were a real and constant threat. Yet this incident did not fit that environment. It was not an elaborate plan, not a violent breakout, not a tunnel dug in secret. It was, in its plainest form, a man walking in restraints between three officers, who was then no longer there. The final note of the record remains unchanged. The convict was listed as an escapee. The officers were cleared of fault. The case stayed unresolved. Today, it is remembered less as a failure and more as a mystery. An event that exposed the limits of procedure, where every control was in place, and yet the outcome defied those controls. The hallway itself remains. The fluorescent lights have been replaced over the years, the linoleum patched, the locks upgraded, but the physical corner where the man vanished is still part of the intake route. Officers still pass through it during transfers. Most days, nothing happens. The sound of boots squeaks on the floor, the gates slam behind, and the rhythm continues as it always has. But for those who know the story, that section of corridor carries a shadow of uncertainty. Because on one afternoon in 1976, a man entered Mountjoy Prison. He was processed at the gate, logged in the books, and escorted along the corridor. He was seen by 3 officers who swore to his presence, and then he was not. That is where the record ends, with an intake logged, a man unaccounted for, and an absence that could not be filled by search, report, or theory. A disappearance in the most controlled of environments, an open question that, to this day, has never been resolved.